Matt Kennard, hello. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, very well, mate. Very, very happy to have you in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. We're here to talk because of your book, Silent Coup, which
Yep.
we'll get into the detail of momentarily. But first, if you could tell us who you are in your own words.
Well, right now I am Chief Investigator at Declassified UK, which is a website which covers British foreign policy, which we set up in 2019 to kind of try and right the fact that the mainstream media doesn't cover British foreign policy at all well, or even at all in a critical way. So we've been working on that for 3 or 4 years and it's gone well. That's not related to what we're here to talk about, which is the book. Before Declassified, I was a fellow and then director at the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. And that fellowship basically was when we did the work for the book. It was actually, we started in 2014, so quite a while ago. It's taken us a while to get it together, but we basically were given fellowships. I wrote the book with a journalist called Claire Provost, who left The Guardian to take this fellowship. I previously worked for the Financial Times. And then the guy that was running the organisation then, the founder, he's called Gavin McFadden, he's dead now, but he's a kind of anarchist. And he basically just said to us, look, you've got 2 years to do whatever you want. So used it wisely, and that was kind of it. We didn't need to check in with him or
What
tell him.
touch.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing, but also daunting, because when you got that much freedom, it's quite scary. But then myself and Claire, we did start talking amongst ourselves about the opportunity that it was. And so we started thinking, what's the biggest story in the world at the moment? Well, we can do something massive and ambitious. And also we had a travel budget as well, so we could go around the world. At that time I didn't have kids, so I had some freedom as well. So we both talked about how we thought that the biggest issue of the day is the corporate takeover of our societies, the political system, the international system of governance. Claire had previously worked at The Guardian looking at aid, which forms quite a large part of the book. I'd been at the Financial Times in Washington, DC, looking at different parts of the World Bank. So we started from there. I mean, the book is structured in 4 parts. And that was how we reported them, that it's the same timeline. And often I think journalists like to say that there was a kind of natural progression in their books to make it sound like they were on this journey of discovery. But that is genuinely how it happened. We started on the first one, and then each part kind of led on to different subjects. The first part was something Claire had been looking at the Guardian, which is called Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS, which sounds boring. And is an acronym. There's a lot of acronyms. I'll try and keep them minimal today, but there's a lot of acronyms in this stuff. And underneath all the boring stuff, what this describes is a system whereby multinational corporations can sue states for enacting policies they don't like. And hardly anyone knows about it. People know about it, obviously, in the industry itself and specialists, but this is a hugely important system that just operates above the heads of government. And sees the transfer of billions of dollars every year from some of the poorest countries in the world to the richest corporations. It also has a chilling effect on policy making all over the world, and it's a massive reason why a lot of policies aren't enacted by governments, because nowadays governments are talking internally about different policies, and they're not talking about them in terms of what's good for our population, what's good for our citizenry. They're saying, are we going to get hit with an investor-state dispute settlement suit from a company if we enact things? And when I say enact things, I'm talking about things like raising the minimum wage. There was a case where a state was sued for raising the minimum wage, or not granting an environmental permit to a mining company to dig. All these things that you think is sovereign policy making are now being chilled by this system. And so we started with that. We moved then on to the aid industry, which is part of it as well, because ISDS is mainly, most of the cases are heard at the World Bank. There's an institution, another acronym called ICSID, the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. And that is the main venue where these cases are heard and decided. But the World Bank is obviously an aid organisation as well. It's publicly funded, and its stated goal is to alleviate global poverty and promote development. But again, the second part of the book is about the fact that that's a sham, and development aid is not about helping the poor of the world develop their economies and become part of the developed world. That is actually about greasing the entry of corporations into those states. And it's also, if you start looking into it, those aid organisations actually literally came out of a lot of the institutions which projected formal empire, which kind of collapsed after the Second World War. So we did that, and then the third section was another thing that we kept on seeing around the world, which was carve-outs from national territory. So there's different elements to this. The main one is what are called Special Economic Zones, SEZs, another acronym, which kind of did get some prominence in the 90s with Naomi Klein and No Logo, and there was in the anti-globalization movement, there was quite a lot of focus on SEZs. And what they are essentially are corporate utopias where corporations and investors don't have to abide by national laws. So they're carve-outs on labour laws. There's certain SEZs where it's illegal to strike, whereas it isn't outside the SEZ. There's no tariffs, there's no customs, there's no duties, there's no minimum wage. There's all these things, basically how the world would look if a corporation designed it. That's what these SEZs are. Another part of that is the private cities, which we're seeing pop up all around the world. Another part of that is gated communities, which are run by corporations. So the third part of the book is looking at all these different elements where physical territory is basically being taken from states. And then the final bit, which is probably the most well-known part of it, was another thing we were seeing was everywhere we went, these sites were being guarded not by regular army soldiers. They were being guarded by private security and private military everywhere. So, and that has huge implications for democracy and the power of the state, because a lot of sociologists, political theorists often said that the power of the state effectively rests on the fact that it has the legitimate resorts of force and violence. That is not the case anymore. And that was quite well known and talked about during the War on Terror. The early part of it, I don't know if you remember the private military contractors like Blackwater and stuff in Iraq. In 2007, 2008, I think there were more private contractors in Iraq than there were Department of Defense personnel. So that was the final part. And then also, so that's the way we kind of divided it up. But what it really describes, I think, is how the corporate coup, which has been really taken off since the 50s, is now nearly complete. And there is barely any part of our society now which is not run in the interests of corporations. And even the nominal power that is exercised by governments is often exercised in the interests of corporations behind the scenes. So that's just a quick summary.
Perfect, no, it's great. I mean, I think A-level politics students, and there's a fair few of them who follow this page, will be familiar with another acronym, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, imposing SAPs, structural adjustment plans, which basically, for people who aren't familiar, is essentially a way for them, they loan cash to nation states in return for basically imposing austerity politics, right? Okay. And from what you've just detailed, take that like A-level version of events, you're sort of like a doctoral thesis almost, the detail in which you've gone into it, it's compelling. Could you talk a bit more about the kind of supranational apparatus that exists above these states? Because you're talking there about, for example, I don't know, raising the minimum wage, or, wanting to prevent the opening of a diamond mine so as to, I don't know, preserve water quality. Yeah. It's actually possible for a company to say, we disagree, we're going to sue you, and not only are we going to sue you, like the amount of money we're going for, it can be a significant proportion of a country's GDP, because we're talking about developing nations. Yeah,
well, there's a case now in Honduras, which is a small country in Central America, where they're closing down a special economic zone, SEZ, and they're getting sued by the company that owns that SEZ for $11 billion. Honduras is a large percentage of their GDP. So the figures are mind-boggling, really. But this system is designed to go above the heads of national governments, and that's why the subtitle of the book is How Corporations Overthrew Democracy. What this means is that states no longer work in the interests of their populations, even democratic ones. That the levers of power have moved over to corporations, and it's by design as well. You mentioned the supranational systems that were built. So we went into the history of a lot of them. And what happened after the Second World War was formal empire was collapsing, particularly in the 50s and 60s. Newly independent countries with leaders that were parts of liberation movements and were nationalizing things, taking power back, and they were freaking out in Washington, London, other imperial capitals, and they were saying, how are we going to maintain our control over the developing world without formal empire? We can't have a garrison of troops in that country that can just take out a leader if he does things we don't like, which is how it worked before, right?
Absolutely.
East India Company and others. So they designed these systems. One of them was this investor-state dispute settlement system, and that was ICSID, the body of the World Bank which hears these cases. That was set up in 1966, which is quite interesting because the 60s was really when decolonization in Africa was really taking off. Another part of the World Bank which deals with the private sector aid financing, the International Finance Corporation, IFC, was set up in 1956, the 50s, another time. So you can see that the reaction was basically we need to stop the ability of peoples acting in what we would think of as enacting sovereign policy making. So, and also I'll just finish with this, in the 50s, three very important things happened which also scared them. One was the Iranian Democratic Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company and made it start working in the interest of the Iranian people, i.e. they got a much bigger take of their own oil than they did before. He was taken out a couple of years later by the CIA and MI6 in a coup in 1953, which overthrew the Iranian democratic government. Iran's never been a democracy ever again. The following year in Guatemala, there was another democratic president. By the way, Mossadegh was not a communist, which is what the British and the Americans were saying. It was part of the Cold War.
We're more a centrist, really.
Yeah, he was, but he was what they call resource nationalist. He believed that it's a pejorative term. They use it as a pejorative, but what it means is that actually maybe the people who are sitting on top of the minerals should maybe benefit from them. But anyway, the same thing happened, in Guatemala the following year, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz was elected a few years before. He started redistributing land to peasants, fallow land which wasn't being used, and some land from United Fruit Company. United Fruit Company engaged the CIA, who overthrew the democratic government in Guatemala. I mean, what happened after that is just horrible. There was eventually a genocide. 200,000 indigenous Guatemalan people were killed in the most horrendous ways. Bill Clinton actually eventually apologized for it when he was president, what happened in Guatemala. But anyway, that happened in 1954. Then 1956 was the Suez Crisis, when Nasser in Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Israel, France, and Britain invaded to try and depose him. It didn't work. But basically, they were basically saying, we don't want to go in hard like this anymore. We don't want to have to keep taking out governments. We want to create an international system where it doesn't matter if there's someone like Nasser in power or Mossadegh or Arbenz. We want to be able to just make them not be able to move. We want to put a straitjacket on them in an economic sense. It's what Thomas Friedman called the golden straitjacket, famously. So ISDS was a major part of this. And if you look at the internal deliberations and negotiations that were happening at the World Bank, which we did, we went to the archives in Washington, they're quite explicit about this. They're saying we need some way of ensuring that we can maintain our control. And the other thing is, it's totally against capitalist philosophy and ideas, isn't it? Because capitalism is all about risk, and what this does is take the de-risk investment for these companies. Because if you go to the Congo and open a diamond mine, it's dodgy. Definitely, you might get nationalized, you might get your asset taken by a paramilitary force, anything could happen, but the point is that high risk is because you might get a high return. This insures you against that risk, because it says if the government does anything I don't like, I can just take them to these courts. And a really, really obscene example of this was in South Africa, post-apartheid, because we went to South Africa to report on this case, actually. And this was a case about the black empowerment policies which were enacted after the fall of apartheid. And essentially, South Africa was, even under Mandela, there was quite a lot of criticism of Mandela, actually, on the economic side from people in South Africa, dissidents and people who were part of the anti-apartheid movement, because they think that he didn't go hard enough in an economic sense. I mean, there's arguments about how much he could move, but basically South Africa was integrated into this system. They signed huge amounts of bilateral investment treaties, which are, they're called BITs, another acronym. But what this did was enshrine this legal system where corporations could sue in law, in South African law, and open them up to all these cases after the fall of apartheid when they enacted black empowerment policies. This one case we looked at, one of the black empowerment policies was mining companies had to give 30, I think it was around 30% of their shareholding to historically disadvantaged people, so black people. Most did it. This one granite company in Italy decided, nah, we don't like that, we're going to take you to ICSID. So they sued South Africa and said, this impinges on our investor rights, we don't want to give part of our... And the South Africans were quite scared because they thought if they publicise it, then they're going to get hit with all sorts of suits from different companies. So it was really low level. Not many people in South Africa knew about it when we arrived. But what happened eventually was they settled out of court and they were exempted from those regulations. And South Africa basically did that because they didn't want to attract more and more cases. And this is what's happening all around the world. It's crazy when you go around the world. You talk to any government which is going against the corporatocracy and going against the corporate ruled international system, and all of them are talking about this ISDS system, all of them. So it was quite conscious at the time of the fall of formal empire that they wanted to create a supranational system which could go above the heads of national governments. And I know this sounds like tinfoil hat stuff, but it's real. And if you read the declassified files or the archival documents from the World Bank, they say it. The public posture is very different, obviously, because it's all about all the wonderful things they want to give to the rest of the world. But internally, they say that they're honest about it. And I'll finish with this, with the legal system, which we've discussed. It's one of the few systems that barely has any legitimate ideology to justify it. Like, you know, most of these systems, even here, like with neoliberalism, like the Tories, at least you can kind of follow an argument in a comment piece where they're talking about privatizing something. Like there are arguments for it that are rational. I mean, I don't agree with them, but with the case of this legal system, there's barely anything that they can use to justify it, that they can say, oh, it creates this kind of benefit for the poor world. The only one they use is that corporations will be much more inclined to enter new markets if they know they're insured against getting their assets expropriated or the minimum wage being raised or whatever it is. But that's just not true, because Brazil is one of the unique countries which has never signed up to any of these agreements which enshrine the ISDS system, and it's never signed up to ICSID, and it doesn't have a problem with foreign direct investment, does it, Brazil? I mean, there's tons and tons of ideology about this, and you mentioned the structured adjustment programs. That was really when this system took off, not just the legal system, the whole corporate rule system, because, as you said, the debt crisis in Latin America in the 80s was leveraged to enact a really, really extremist form of economics, which is called neoliberalism now. But basically says you've got to completely deregulate your economy, get rid of capital controls, get rid of subsidies for food, fuel, anything that benefits the poor, get rid of tariffs, sign up to all these treaties which enact this legal system, all these different elements of it. And it's basically been a disaster everywhere it's been trialed. There's barely anywhere that can point to successes, even in like East Asia, like South Korea and places that some people point to as, they've all protected their own industries when they've been developing, because you have to. It's like in Latin America, they called it import substitution, where you would not just open your country up to be flooded by products from elsewhere. You would you'd protect your infant industries, and they would grow, and then they would provide. And that happened in Latin America for quite a few decades, and then it was all smashed up by the IMF and World Bank, essentially. And I mean, I spend quite a lot of time in Argentina for family reasons, and that's one example of a country which has just been destroyed by neoliberalism, which has been pushed on it by the IMF and World Bank, particularly the IMF. The previous government to now signed the biggest IMF loan in history. They basically mortgaged their country for 100 years. They can't do anything, they can't move for 100 years. So, but that's an extreme case, but it happened all across Latin America and the world. And we still live with the results of that. There's no change in ideology. After the Second World War, when the Bretton Woods institutions, which are used to describe the IMF and the World Bank, because they were both created at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in 1944, they did have, it was quite successful for like 20, 30 years. They often, like in economics departments, they call it like a golden age of capitalism after the Second World War. Welfare states were created. There wasn't this extremist idea, the system that was put down by the Americans and Brits, essentially. It was John Maynard Keynes on our side and a guy called Harry Dexter White on the US side. It worked quite well and equitably. And then it was all smashed up by this extreme neoliberalism and these structural adjustment programs which enforced it. And we're still living with that. And it's very, very hard to escape this system. It's extremely, extremely hard because the institutions create this structural pressure on all sides that means you can't move. And I will finish with this guy. I know I keep saying I'll finish this, but we went to El Salvador, and this was a really interesting experience for me because we went there when the FMLN were in power, and the FMLN is the political party that came out of the Marxist guerrillas in the 80s in the Civil War. So they're serious people in terms of their politics. They were in power, and they were basically doing nothing. And we were saying to them, why are you not enacting any policies? And they were just saying, there's absolutely no, we can't move. We nationalise that, we'll get hit with a ISDS suit. We take back control of XYZ, we'll be hit with something else. We've got an aid program from the US that if we do this thing, they'll withdraw it. So there's just there's this web of control which is enforced on the developing world in quite literal ways. And in El Salvador's case, they lost the Civil War, so they were just integrated into this system. And then 20, 30 years later, you do have a liberation government which has been voted by the people, but they can't move. And there's the very, very literal way that they do this is something they call sunset clauses, which are often embedded in these agreements, these free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties. And sunset clauses describes how even if you cancel that agreement, you can't, it doesn't actually become cancelled until 10 years later. So they're hoping that in 10 years' time, there won't be a government that will have the same belief that the country doesn't need this agreement, and they can just keep it in place. So it's impossible to move.
Hoping, yeah. I think it's also important. A key distinction is, we're talking about Bretton Woods, we're talking about United Fruits, and we're talking about the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. We're talking about the East India Company. A lot of those companies, they still exist today, right? We're talking when we say United Fruits, it's Chiquita. Yeah. When we talk about Anglo-Iranian, it's BP, right? Yeah. And it's not just that, they had these ideas that still exist today. It's the literal infrastructure of the corporation still exists today. They've rebranded, but it's the same body, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that's the funny thing, is that the whole edifice is just a rebrand. Like, they call it post-colonialism. I know there's critical post-colonialism that argues that it's a continuation of post-colonialism, but a lot of people just say, in a lot of people's minds, that the colonial period ended. It never did. It was rebranded. Even development itself is a PR tool idea. Like I've described, a lot of these institutions, aid institutions, development institutions, were just about enforcing capitalism and corporate rule on the developing world as formal empire collapsed. And there's another part of it which is just massively taken off now, which is corporate social responsibility, or CSR, right? And that is that's just another extreme way to make money, a PR tool to make money, and to make it impossible to know for your average Joe what is going on with corporate power, because everything is. There's so much effort put into putting this like patina of altruism on everything, and then the media is owned by the corporations as well, so they just repeat it. So it's impossible. There's barely any spaces where you can get critical coverage of corporations. And the other part of this is also the NGO sector, because the NGO sector again is infested with corporations, and that is such a powerful tool for corporations, because if Oxfam, Save the Children, all these brands that have such household value and are seen as providing good for the world, are allying with corporations and basically whitewashing their activities in the developing world, it's very hard to fight, and most journalists don't push back against it. When we went to El Salvador, for, like I mentioned, we had one case where we wrote a story about a poor community that were living on top of an aquifer just outside San Salvador, the capital, and they were not able to afford water for their kids, and we went and saw it. It was awful. And then down the road, all these major multinationals were bottling Coke and other things. One of them was called Sab Miller. And we did the story for The Guardian. It went on their website under the Bill Gates Foundation logo. which because Bill Gates funds their development website, that you start seeing that this panorama, this web of control that corporations, or at least corporate-friendly foundations, have, and then they 2 days later. This article was quite hard-hitting. 2 days later, Sam Miller had an interview in The Guardian, not directly referencing our article, but defending their basically blaming water stress in Latin America on the governments, which is what they always do. They say it's corruption, these like buzzwords. Yep. I thought that was quite weird because it wasn't an advertorial and it wasn't a reply to our article. So I looked into it, and Sam Miller actually was funding a part of The Guardian's website. So The Guardian had given the last word to one of the biggest corporations in the world over the voices of some of the poorest people in the world, just because that is how deep corporate control is. And the piece of the puzzle that I actually missed out on this is that Sam Miller sent me when I approached him for comment about this situation with this community, and they said, "Oh no, you got it all wrong. Here's a report we've co-authored with Oxfam America about this case," which basically exculpated them from any blame. So we live in, I know it sounds like a conspiracy stuff, but we live in a matrix of control that corporations have built up, because they have all the money. They have all the money. The two power centers in our society are states and corporations, really.
Do you think I don't want to shoot down the whole premise of your book. Is it oversimplifying it? Is it too binary to say, on the one hand we've got corporations, on the other hand we've got governments, and they're in conflict with each other, and that's the end of it? Do you think that sort of boils it down a little bit too far?
I don't think that's true.
Go on.
I think that's a major misconception that everyone has. Like, I don't think they're adversarial at all. I think governments work for corporations. And I didn't think that in the same way before I went around the world for researching the book, because I was talking to people who were the victims of corporations, whether it be, I don't know, ones who are hiring paramilitaries to kill trade unionists in Colombia, or people trying to organise in Cambodia in an SEZ, all these people. I'd always ask them, well, what's your government doing for you? Because you're obviously getting done over by these corporations, the people that should be protecting you, the government. And everyone would say, the government, to them it was a silly question. They said, the government works for the corporation. And that is what it looks like on the ground, and that's what I found. And the other amazing point of this is that you think that projects in the developing world, like corporate projects, you think that they're capitalist endeavours. I'm not exaggerating when I say 80 to 90% of every project I was investigating for, and Claire as well was investigating for this book, I'd find that there was some development financing for it, which is public money, everywhere. That was a real revelation for me, because they're in nearly every part of capitalist and corporate endeavours in the developing world have some aid part to it. And there's obviously the World Bank, which is the main one, but there's regional development banks as well, like the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the IADB in Latin America. So it's all, and what it is it's not about aid and development, it's about locking countries into corporate-friendly policies. So that's a very literal example of how public money and public institutions are basically working in the interests of corporations. And it is true that, what you say, it is true that this is ever been thus. There is an element of that. I'm not saying that this is some new thing that we've discovered. Corporations have always, but what I think's happened in the last, particularly since the Second World War, with the age of the multinational, which has benefited from the economic architecture that we talked about that was erected after the Second World War. What's happened with that is that I think it's gone massively international, and I think that since the end of the Cold War, when there hasn't been another pole to organise around, if you're an independent country and you want to do something different. It's just gone wild, because now we have China, which is definitely going on the rise and will be and is already another pole that the developing world can organise around. It's hyper-capitalist. We went to Shenzhen, which I mentioned, special economic zones. Now, China's whole rise to economic superpower status is based on the SEZ model. Deng Xiaoping, who opened up the economy, opened up the first SEZ in China in 1980, which was Shenzhen. Shenzhen is now 1 million people live there. It's huge. It's the biggest SEZ in the world. And we went there, and it's just hyper-capitalism. Workers have no rights. There's CCTV cameras everywhere. you're basically under the complete control of the corporation or the state. It's dystopian. And that's the other pole now. So it's not like the Soviet Union. There is no other economic model. And the scarier thing about China was the SEZ model was perfect for them because the Communist Party could maintain control of the state while developing this Wild West private sector, but just in these enclaves. And obviously SEZs are all over the world. So I think that I think that the books. Well, I don't want to speak for Claire, but from my perspective, I think that there are two major power centers in our society, which is the state and the corporation. And the corporation has eaten the state, which created it. And you can actually delineate that, because the other interesting part of that is this is not this war between the two, which was actually a war before, but has been won by the corporation, in my opinion. But it started in the modern corporation. They say, or historians debate when the invention of the modern corporation happened, but a lot of them put it down to 16th century England, not far from here actually, in the city of London, and they were chartered companies, so they were basically completely under the control of then the crown. You know, you'd receive a charter from the Queen or King, and it would be a time-limited thing. It would be for one job, or it would be one trade route. In East India Company's case, it was like a third of the globe that they got their charter covered for trade. The first joint stock company, which is it was called in the modern version was called the Muscovy Company in London, and that was for trade route to Russia. But what you see is like the corporation as a sort of economic instrument has just been waging a war against the state to get more and more power. And obviously, back then it was a privilege to get a charter and open a corporation. Right now it's a right that happened through legislative changes in the 19th century, and it happened. It happened. Most of it happened in the 19th century, but it really took off on an international sense, and this in a supranational international sense after the Second World War. So I think that right now it's very hard to see how governments can act against corporate interests. I can't, especially in the developing world, but also here, because the other part of the book that was quite interesting was that what we call the boomerang effect, where a lot of these systems that were set up to continue dominating the developing world are now coming back to roost and coming back to the countries where they were created. So Germany was kind of the birthplace of the ISDS system that I talked about, and they got hit with a massive legal case from a Swedish energy company, a coal company, for some environmental permit, and also for their decommissioning of their nuclear power plants. They were hit with a billions suit from the same Swedish company. In the UK, free ports, we've got 13 free ports we're opening, which are just SEZs, and so the corporations are now coming back and eating the states that created this international infrastructure and designed this international system where they could benefit from the developing world. So I think there's much scope for pushing back against it, to be honest. It's so complete, the control. And even the media itself, which you would hope would do the job of at least notifying people of what's happening, doesn't, because structurally it can't. It's like you wouldn't trust Pravda in the Soviet Union to tell you the truth about what the Soviet government was doing and the Soviet regime. But I think it's a bit of a arse to think that the corporate-owned media, owned by corporations, is going to tell you the truth about the corporate-run system. So there's space for independent media to do the job, and you guys are doing a great job. We try, but we're kind of pushing against the massive. In terms of reaching a mass of people, and in a more sort of UK way, you saw what happened to someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who was one of the first leaders that really was against, or at least wanted to push back against corporate power in this country. Tax havens, they had quite advanced and sophisticated and radical policies on the British tax haven network. In their manifesto, and the corporate media system destroyed him. And it's very hard to see where the cracks are. I don't want to. if you ask me a question about what makes me optimistic, I can also answer that. I was giving you quite a nightmare scenario.
Yeah. And I can't imagine that those policies are going to be in the Labour Party's next manifesto.
No.
But that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about non-commercial loans.
Yeah.
Because, well, a couple of examples, they're slightly different, but it might be a diamond mine in Tanzania or in Lidl.
Yeah.
These are, let's say, two big companies, right? De Beers, Lidl. They have access to traditional financing options that every corporation has access to. You can take your pick, you can get loans. But they have access to public money. In Lidl's case, we're literally talking about the British taxpayer, right? Via the European Bank, right?
Yeah.
How on earth have we ended up in a situation where taxpayer money is going towards funding the corporate expansion of, let's say a successful supermarket chain? And why is that happening in the name of development? Because when you hear the phrase development, you're sort of thinking, I don't know, water quality programs, you're thinking education, you're not thinking, let's build more Lidls in Poland.
It's a very good question. I think basically it's because development is not how people commonly understand it. It's not about, or at least practiced by the World Bank and the institutions of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which you referenced, or DFID, DFID doesn't exist anymore, or the development part of the Foreign Office. They don't see development like what you're talking about, like water programs or whatever it is. They see it as a tool for enforcing their big business interests, and it's never been different. You can see it's exactly the same from the start. So to them, the other part of that is there's an ideology which has developed, which obviously justifies that to people that ask, and also to the people working within the system themselves, because no one wants to think that they're doing monstrous things like using public money to help Lidl expand in Poland for no reason. But they all tell themselves that their idea of development. So when they talk about why they would do it, if you ask them, which we did, why are you doing this? They say, well, their whole development idea is that it has to be based on foreign investment. So there's no other way to develop an economy apart from just making yourself as attractive as possible to foreign investment, and to making yourself as attractive as possible to corporations, because corporations are going to be the ones that are going to take their resources and their money and open a plant or a shop, whatever it is in your country, and that will create jobs. And then that will create economic activity around the plant or the shop, and then there'll be a spin-on effect that will develop the whole economy. It doesn't stack up, but the reason that they push it, and the reason that it has become religion, is because it benefits corporations, but also it benefits the capitalist system, which a lot of these institutions were set up during the Cold War, when there was real fear, and people around the world actually were clamoring for something a bit different, and they needed to make sure that the capitalism was spread and was strong, and I think that's a big part of it is the sort of geopolitical economic part of it, is that they needed this specific system and this private sector to be as big as possible. So the IFC, which I mentioned, was the private sector lending arm, which is the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, which funds diamond mines, 5-star hotels in Myanmar, Lidl in Poland, like all these crazy things. The IFC was created in 1956, when at the height of the Cold War, when they wanted to push back against communism everywhere. And the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development opened in 1991, when they were basically just like, the Soviet Union had fallen. They wanted to make sure that capitalism was going to penetrate all the old Soviet bloc markets and just make it impossible for any kind of alternative to ever rise up again. So that's why. And then they put a sticker on it and call it development, which is confusing if you start looking into it. But most people don't know. This is the other thing about this stuff, is that it's all done so under the radar, and you can't find out. Like barely anyone. Like everyone's shocked when you describe this stuff, and they don't believe you at first, or they say you're chatting rubbish. But then you say, look, it's there in black and white, and then they say, well, that doesn't make sense. But then I'm like, yes, it doesn't make sense if you're accepting the premises which are given effectively by these institutions and by the papers. But it's a massive racket. Aid aid was the wildest part of this whole ride. Like it was crazy to see that it's so opposite to what they say. And then obviously there's the labour law part of it as well, which is like Lidl, you mentioned that how they treat their workers. Like some of the places other places I went to when I was looking at companies that were receiving development financing, public money, like they treat their workers so badly. And there's one report that we found from the Asian Development Bank about promoting SEZs in Cambodia, about why women were particularly good for that, because they had nimble fingers and they were more meek, so they would be less likely to strike or put any resistance to the corporations, and that's explicit down there. So that is the kind of part of this that is really tragic, is how difficult it is to work for workers to organise against the power of these institutions, because essentially you go around and you see workers in SEZs that are getting paid below the minimum wage because they can be. It's impossible for them to organise because they're cut off from society by design. And it's desperate. I mean, it's really, really desperate. The most profound experience I had in the whole book was going to Cambodia and talking to two different types of union. There's what they call yellow unions there, which are basically affiliated to the corporations and the state. That's what, like, they work together. And basically they were just, the people who were members of those unions were getting shafted, and it was a way of controlling them. And then there were independent unions, a couple, amazing people that were like were sneaking into SEZs to organise properly. Some of them had been shot dead, and it was just showed you the power. Like the repression of them was huge. Cambodia's been a dictatorship for a long time, and the repression of them really showed me just like the power of independent democratic unions. They're profound, important institutions in our society, extremely civilized institutions that really make a difference to people's lives. Like the people that had, and actually in Cambodia, I just saw last week, Human Rights Watch released a statement about how 9 trade unionists in Cambodia that were organizing for better wages and better conditions had been put in jail for years. So, and that's the real results of all this. It's not, and that's again away from the mainstream view. There was, again, a couple of decades ago, quite a lot of talk about where the Nike make their trainers and sweatshops and stuff. That kind of has dissipated from the mainstream discourse. But that is the result of all this stuff. People working in sweatshops for dirt wages, getting treated like rubbish by their bosses, impossible for them to organise, maybe even getting put in prison if you organise. So, yes, it's a dystopian picture. And then obviously the other side is it makes it one section of society extremely rich. And that is the local elites that benefit from these systems, and the people in London, Washington, Frankfurt, wherever it is, where all the money is going. And that is again a function of the private security, private cities part of this, is that we're creating such an unequal society now through these different systems that the elites that are benefiting from them are having to like carve themselves out of society, because all the problems, they don't want to have to deal with all the rubbish of all the poor people that can't, that are desperate now. Like this country particularly, you see it on the streets, and people are retiring to these gated communities where they rent private security, which can like threaten people if they come anywhere near. And that's kind of where we're going. We're going to have 2 parallel existences. We've already got it essentially, but I think that is the logical conclusion of what we're talking about.
Other than Cambodia, are there other examples you could point to where communities have successfully resisted?
Good question. There is. Yeah. No. And actually, I don't want to be too pessimistic, because it was quite a hopeful experience as well. And one case which I've been obsessed with for like 20 years now. Let's just stop going on about it. But which is Bolivia. And there was a very, very actually quite famous case in 2000 where they privatized water in a city in Bolivia. It's the 3rd city called Cochabamba, which is a majority indigenous city. And Bechtel, the US company, got the contract, and they massively jacked up prices for water. They even criminalized collecting rainwater. And there was huge outpouring of protest, dissidents, and they were on the streets for weeks, and then it became known as the Water Wars. There's a film actually by Gael Garcia Bernal about that, about the whole event, and they won. So they did in the end get hit with a ISDS case by Bechtel when they didn't give them when they had to cancel their contract. They got hit with a case, but again, shows that it's impossible to escape. But they won in the sense that Bechtel were kicked out, and the prices weren't jacked up, and people could afford water. And then one of the major leaders of that protest was Evo Morales, who was then a congressman and the head of the Coca Union. 5 years later, he was elected the first indigenous president and the Democratic Socialist president. And he was elected in 2005, took power in 2006. Over the next 10 years, completely transformed that society through doing everything that the World Bank tells you not to do. And then eventually was praised by the World Bank later on. But they nationalized hugely. They renegotiated contracts with all the corporations, which had got these just obscene deals, like this is what I'm talking about, the comprador governments. The governments, they don't care. They're mostly, they're working for Washington, they're working for the corporations. So they say, when a corporation comes and says, oh yeah, well, that oil contract, we get 82% of that, we'll give you 12%. Okay. Their mentality is not, we need to keep this for the people. So in fact, I interviewed Evo Morales in his house in the Amazon rainforest last year. And he was talking to me about the fact that they were taken to ICSID for these nationalizations they were doing, but he also just said, like, before MAS, which was his government, his party took power, the corporations just design policy explicitly. They'd come in and talk to ministers, and that was all based on the idea that we can't develop Bolivia unless corporations come and invest. Which means the corporations just rape your country, essentially. So he reversed all that. Then he was a victim of a coup himself in 2019. This obviously complicated the political situation there, but there was a coup, which was backed by the US and Britain. And then they came back. So I'll finish on a very optimistic note, which is that a Western-backed or UK-backed coup, which overthrows a leader who is using his or her resources for the people of the country. In history, that it's worked. Like Allende is a famous case in Chile in 1973 when the CIA organized a military coup and they threw the Democratic Socialist president, out. He died. He killed or committed suicide. But that was it. 17 years of dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. In the case of Bolivia, I think this might be the first case. It's the first case that I know about. They overthrew the democratic government, installed a puppet government, a far-right interim president, but the following year, democracy was restored, and the MAS party, Evo Morales' party, won the elections. And they're in power now, and doing good things. So there is that's a really good example of how you can fight back successfully. But it's quite a unique case because when I was there interviewing Morales, he's in this. He lives in this like tiny little, town in the middle of the Amazon. But I did do quite a few interviews with the union people and people there and activists, and it's an incredibly organised population, the indigenous population. It was so inspiring, there's meetings all the time. The unions have just endless committees. It's just everyone is engaged in the political process. It's completely different from here. And that is why they could resist it, I think, that there was a level of organisation that we just don't have here, and that is quite rare anywhere, really. But that is how you do it, effectively. You need to organise resistance, and specifically, you need to organise unions, because in terms of like the grand forces that can take on the powers that I've talked about, the institutions that I've talked about, organised labour is the only one with the degree of power and people power, but financial power, whatever it is, that can take on that kind of corporate power. And they know that. That's why they do. That's why they divide and rule the workers. Like I talked about the yellow unions and that. But there's ways to do it. It's just I think that we should be a bit more humble here and in the US and other places and say, well, we should look at places like Colombia and see, how did you do it? How did you manage to get this level of consciousness? How did you get this level of organisation that you can really fight back against these systems?
I'd like to tease that out a bit more, because the phrase you used there was, it's completely different to here, right? And I think looking at our current economic, political system and then sort of contrasting that with political debate in the country, a huge amount of oxygen, particularly in Britain. Let's just talk about Britain for the time, right? It's culture war.
Yeah.
It's fucking take your pick. I don't know, trans ideology. Yeah. You know, changing the words in Roald Dahl books. You know, whatever nonsense thing it is they're talking about, right? And I just would like to invite your reflections on that. Whether it's almost a tool, right? Yeah. That seeks to distract you from the big problem over here.
Yeah, I think so. I've got to be careful what I say.
Go on.
no, it's just it's an extremely toxic issue. I think that's also a function of what you're talking about, in that the culture wars, I think, are or identity politics, or corporate-friendly identity politics, is a cultural phenomenon which is rooted in the corporate takeover of our society, because it's like you say, it's a distraction, but it's not a distraction because the issues aren't important. Like trans rights, gay rights, all these things, they are important, but why are we talking? It's the proportion that we're talking about them at now. They dominate the whole discourse, and it's extremely beneficial to corporations, and they use it explicitly. Like there was a Lockheed Martin, which is the largest arms company in the world, they funded some conference in the States, I can't remember what it was called, last week, but everyone had like pronoun badges that were going in, and it was just not seen as bad that these people who are progressive maybe on these gender issues do not see any problem with being funded by a arms company. It's like the New Statesman, which talks about all these, presents itself as this progressive institution, and probably got really good politics on trans or gay rights or whatever it is. They're funded by the BAE Systems, which has spent 7 years destroying Yemen, like made it in the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, millions of kids on the brink of starvation. But it's a way of dressing up. It again goes back to the corporate thing, isn't it? It's a way of dressing up these really ugly actions and ugly corporations in nice progressive rhetoric. And then, but I do think that the left is not blameless, because obviously you have to fight back against some of it, but they engage in it as well, and they censor and deplatform people in a way that I think will come back to haunt them. I think that the censoriousness of the left now, so around certain issues, is really, really bad, and because the left should be defenders of free speech, because we'll be hit at some point down the road. If we have no track record of defending people we don't agree with, then we got no leg to stand on, you know. It's interesting because as a cultural phenomenon, it doesn't really exist in places where there's actually like proper left or democratic socialist governments doing good stuff. Like in Latin America, where I've spent most time and know most about, probably doesn't really happen in the same way. Like Lula is talking really specifically. He'll talk about abortion and stuff like this, but he has really strident positions on really red line topics that you wouldn't get leftists here talking about, like the war in Ukraine or nationalizations. Same with the Mas government in Bolivia, and the Correa government in the previous one in Ecuador. I've been in all those countries, and it's completely different. And I think that's because the discourse and the system there is not controlled in the same way by corporations. They don't have the same need to control it, because they're much more need to control the discourse in places with extreme power like we have here and in Washington. But yeah, I think that it definitely is, and I definitely think it's a distraction, because we don't talk about look at the economic structural issues in this country. The country's in a complete mess, and the austerity program that the Tories enacted just decimated. I think it must be one of the most horrific hammerings of the poor that there's been in British history. and we're still living with the results of that. And I just find, I think that it benefits the right, because, and I'll finish with this, I think the other thing about identity politics and the censoriousness of the left is it plays into the right's hands, because they can say, you know, like the Tories now know that the only way they can win an election is on the culture war stuff. That's why when Boris Johnson left and Liz Truss, everyone was saying, oh, well, at least Rishi Sunak's not an extremist. He'll get rid of people like Suella Braverman. But he knew that the only way he's going to win an election is by keeping her in post and keeping her as Home Secretary, hammering the immigrants and whoever it is, because there's no other way they can do it, because they have to get people working against their own class, voting against their own class interests. And I think that when you read some of the shit, if I can use that word, in the Daily Mail, some of it has kernels of truth about how you can't say this, you can't say that. It's true. There are certain things, and people see it, feel it outside in the country. I can't even say what I think without getting called X, Y, Z. It's really, really destructive and really alienates the working class, particularly from the Labour, I don't even know if we have a left in this country, whatever we call the left in this country, you know, it does. It completely alienates them, because also the other thing is they're looking at the political system and saying, who's talking to my needs, who's talking to my issues? And a lot of the left just aren't. They're talking about stuff that, like, I don't want to be specific, but there's things that a lot of people have never even thought about for more than a couple of seconds, that they're getting inundated with as the most important part of their lives. I don't think that, and I do think that's a function of corporations controlling the discourse, and I don't think the left is immune at all, and the left might even be worse in some ways. Not consciously, but have adopted some of that. Yeah.
Matt Kennard, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I think we'll have to have you back to talk about domestic politics and not just corporations. Thanks so much for coming in, mate.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it.
Cheers.